Hi, welcome to the seminar on users. So who is your invention for exactly? Have you taken into account the different types of users that might experience the device or platform that you're proposing? These are the questions that will be in the background of today's seminar. And thus far in the semester, we've covered some pretty grand, sweeping ideas about media, and we haven't really acknowledged the role of the user yet, perhaps with the exception of the week on software, when we discussed how certain types of software disadvantage certain users. So today we'll be talking about the user from a few different angles. One that sees the mass as stupid zombies who will consume anything. One that applies user experience or user X to kind of understand users' sort of experiences with media. That's sort of an industry perspective. And then a third approach, which sort of places more agency and power in the arena of the user and tries to understand how users can make statements on the media they consume by jamming systems and by sort of taking advantages of the structure of the media at play in order to make a statement. So all of these fall along a spectrum that Stuart Hall might call dominant, negotiated, and oppositional consumptions of media. And you might have encountered Stuart Hall already in your BCom degree, but he argues that you fall into one of three different camps when you interact with media. You use it exactly as its creators want you to use it and interpret it. You might use it or read it in a way that is entirely oppositional to what it was intended for, or you might fall somewhere in between. So an example of a dominant reading would be watching an old-fashioned Western cowboys and Native Americans film where you're on the side of the cowboys. An oppositional reading, and one that anthropologist Derek Michaels observed, was that Aboriginal people in Australia, and when watching the same American television shows, were cheering for the Native Americans. Not surprising. So that's an oppositional reading. So you can think of users as falling along this spectrum, and take a moment to think about the last film that you watched and where you fell along this spectrum. Was it a bad movie that you laughed at? That might be oppositional, because bad movie makers don't necessarily intend for their precious artworks to be jeered at later on. Was it a riveting horror film where you were totally immersed? That might be dominant. You were kind of consuming it in the way that its makers wanted you to consume it. Or was it a romantic comedy where you were invested, but at the same time critical of its portrayals of gender, perhaps, and its unfair portrayals of masculinity? And that would be a negotiated reading, sort of in between. So it's a really good sort of framework for perhaps anticipating and understanding how your users might experience your platform. You might want to ask, what are these three camps what are these three camps that might exist with what you're making? Okay, so the first sort of standpoint that I wanted to cover is that the user is stupid. So a certain school of thought emerged in the mid-20th century called the Frankfurt School, that saw the masses as being placid cows that would watch anything given to them. And take into consideration that many in the school were people who had fled and escaped Nazi Germany, and certainly this experience colored their view of humanity and what it might do when under instruction. So someone like Walter Benjamin, who escaped Germany and stayed a while in France, thought that photography actually dumbed people down because it robbed real experiences of something he called aura, an intangible, almost indescribable feeling of beauty that you get when beholding a landscape or a piece of art in the flesh. The picture of the mountain has no aura. Standing in front of the mountain has aura. That's an auratic experience. And he says that photography and cinema and any reproducible art form, meaning any sort of technology that can make copies of something, he says that photography and cinema ensure that experience is reproducible and that it robs the originals of their originality. So why see the Mona Lisa in the flesh when its originality has been so diluted because it's been reproduced so often? So some people might find reproducible technology democratizing. So now everyone can see the Mona Lisa, whether you're rich or poor. If you can't afford to travel, you can see the Mona Lisa. But Benjamin argues that the masses want to bring the outside world ever closer to their home and to themselves, to the point where they don't want to venture out at all. So he's calling us pretty lazy. And we just want everything imported into our eyeballs and our homes, and we don't want to go out and have auratic experiences. He also says, and I think this does ring true, that when you reproduce a famous work of art, you are destroying its context. So the sculptures at Chartres Cathedral in Chartres, France, are meant to be experienced with the cathedral, in the cathedral, as part of the cathedral. The cave paintings at Lascaux are meant to be experienced in the cave itself. Uluru is meant to be experienced there in that location. So he also writes about how concentration has been replaced by a state of distraction. So we can no longer take in a painting at length. We lose an ability to understand the world because our attention spans are growing ever smaller. And we grow into a state of ongoing distraction through media that is never ending, and we lose the ability to meditate on a single thing and take in its beauty. So at the end of his essay on reproducible art in the age of on reproducible art, he talks about Nazism and how fascist regimes have taken advantage of people's constant states of distraction to make them do terrible things. In other words, he sees media technology advancements as going hand in hand with the upwards pattern in fascist regimes around the world. So pretty cynical. If you want to read his most famous essay, it's The Work of Art in the Age of Reproducible Technology. It's pretty interesting. It has all, I gave you a digest of it right now, but if you want to read it, in a more kind of detailed way, you can take a look at it. So that's the Frankfurt School. And that's sort of the school of thought that exists today that thinks that the masses are being dumbed down by new media technology. And it existed in the era of television, where the sort of term for what you call zombies today, it was telebuggies, where people were just sat in front of the television and just kind of were glued to the screen for hours and hours and didn't think anymore. So there's this kind of pattern of you can think of it in two ways. You can think of it that it is true that advancements in technology kind of err on the side of distraction that could that fuel fascism, or but is a really kind of valid opinion if you want to kind of think about fake news as kind of being very damaging to our democracy. So Benjamin would probably agree with that. Or you could think of it in terms of a discourse. So there is a discourse or discussion being had about dumb media consumers all the time. With every kind of technological advancement, there is that sort of discussion being had. So you can kind of view it either way. User experience. So taking now an industry. So we took the perspective of people fleeing Nazi Germany, it into account. They were pretty cynical and, for understandable reasons. Now we're going to take the experience of industry through exploring user experience. So this might be another way of, I'm just giving you an array of ways to think about users for your projects. You don't have to kind of take all of them on board. You can focus on one sort of model that works for you. So whether tech companies believe in the masses being stupid or not, they apply a certain approach to creating products for them that is embedded in the design experience. And it's called user experience, also called UX or user X. And I'm sure you've encountered this by now in our program. And I think some of you might find it particularly useful to your projects if you fall somewhat in the neutral territory of conceiving users as, not falling into sort of agential warriors or, stupid cows, like, somewhere in between. So in essence, user experience is about how people use and connect to a product that is studied during the design phase, usually through the use of focus groups and interviewing and observing people. So in film, this usually takes the form of screening focus groups before a film is released, and it still has an opportunity to be reshot and re-edited based on feedback. Karpanos et al. Theorized the process by which users integrate a new technology into their lives, and this follows 4 major nodes, and this might be useful to you. Let's take the example of the home IPA like Alexa. There is the users anticipating what Alexa might do for them while they wait for it in the email. There's a phase of orientation when people are playing around with the device and they don't really know what to do with it quite yet. There's the phase of incorporation during which they begin to realize what they can do with it and how best to use it in the long term. They determine the device's value, a use value, in other words. And then there's the final phase of emotionally connecting to the device or identifying with it on some level. So that final phase is very much reflected in our experiences with our smartphones, which we covered in previous tutorials as sort of being either cyborgian extensions of ourselves or I don't know, a drug-like hard candy that is tantalizing and stimulating. This particular model, phased model, might be useful for those studying failed technologies. So you might ask, at which phase did your original technology sort of fail exactly? And where can you swoop in and kind of fix the experience? Primoral and Moles expand on this framework to add more factors to how people approach new media technologies, and they study household AI systems, specifically like Google Home, and why there are significant hurdles for AI systems to clear for their complete integration. And they state some of the barriers of entry here, of why these systems are kind of difficult to be fully integrated. The first point is that people might not be entirely sure how these devices should be used and didn't perceive a need for them. Something called effort expectations. The users perceived a substantial amount of labor being demanded to train these devices. These became particularly influential when it comes to cost. So the 2 first bullet points I mentioned come into play when sort of evaluating the pros and cons and the sort of uses versus the cost. There was also a concern about the time and money to set up a connectable home. Another perceived cost was data collection, which didn't seem to be worth the potential benefits of the device. Something called hedonic desire. So after a period of initial fun, the sort of initial novelty and fun and curiosity wore off, and then people stopped using it. So they argue that the best case scenario is where people integrated the device into their daily routines, but people negotiated privacy by hitting the mute button and through the kind of degree to which they wanted the device to be integrated into their homes. So that's kind of their coverage of, why AI devices might not be adopted in homes, and also what it looks like when they are. So these are some of the concerns and questions that user experience people would be invested in. So notice it allows the user a great degree of agency, greater than the theories of Benjamin, but it still operates on the assumption that we can fix or choreograph users' interactions with media. That is, if we get the formula just right, we can generate whatever kind of experience we want. And I'll cover the sort of opposite end of the spectrum in the next video. Okay, so we covered two sort of